So thank you very much, Madam Mayor, council members, for allowing me the time for an update on the police strategic plan. I have a total of 7 slides for this first part of the presentation, which is really a very high-level overview of both the accomplishments and priorities for 2020. The strategic plan continues to be a work plan for the department. The picture that you first see on this slide here is 7 of the 9 Proposition 1 officers that were hired in 2019. All have graduated the academy. They're in their final phases of either police training or they've actually been deployed out on to the street on patrol. So I'll just go through a little bit of background. In 2015, with the support of the City Council, now retired Deputy Mayor Marilyn Beard led a steering committee of a cross-section of department staff that included police and corrections officers, command personnel, civilian staff, and the guild president. Approximately 35 staff members participated. Burke Consulting conducted an overview of the entire department with special emphasis placed on conducting a patrol staffing study and making improvements to jail procedures. Aside from the steering committee, input was also gathered from each individual member of the City Council by the consultants and a broad range of community representatives. Those same community representatives were part of the chief selection process in 2016 as well. So the City Council adopted the final report in September 2016 as a work plan, and the members of the department have been assigned to develop and implement the recommendations included in the consultant's report. In January 2018, the department provided an update on the first year of accomplishments to the then Public Safety Committee. And in June 2019, the full council received an update on major work that was completed in the previous year, which was 2018. This was, last year was actually a joint report with the fire department and would have been conducted with Chief Sanford earlier in June, but based on some of the activities that the department was handling at that time, we had graciously moved it, thank you, Kurt, to July. So there are 39 recommendations with a number of sub-recommendations that are included in your council packet, along with notes on whether or not the recommendation has been completed, like the safety camera program, or whether it's ongoing, which may take more time to complete, or if it's in progress, which means we're working on it and expect that we can complete the recommendation. So I've included both the 2017 and 18 brief overview from the presentations that the previous Public Safety Committee and the City Council received. In 17, really our focus was on the recreating the mission, vision, and values of our department. That was the top priority. A small group of staff worked on developing the wording for the mission, vision, and values, and we actually used SurveyMonkey to vote on that. 91 members of the department voted, and this was a big step in changing the culture of the department. Other important 2017 accomplishments, including the development of online reporting that allow community members to file a police report without having to have personal contact with a police officer. Utilizing online reporting is really a collaborative effort with our dispatch center, Norcom, and the Bellevue Police Department. Originally, CopLogic is the online reporting tool. It was intended for use when there's no suspect information or evidence of a crime, cases that are often just documented and closed as there are no further investigative leads. However, I would say that during the initial COVID outbreak, CopLogic was a significantly important program. For reference, we processed 1,134 online reports in 2017, 969 in 2018, and 1,156 in 2019. In 2020, since January, we have received 1,612 online reports, the majority of which were for identity theft due to the state and employment benefits scam theft. So a supervisor still has to review every single submission to ensure that there aren't any investigative leads that could be followed up on, so there's still staff time to process each complaint. But many of the online reports in 2020 during COVID have had evidence of crimes, and we've required police officers to follow up on those complaints. And we really, I should say, relaxed the regulations on that to increase social distancing during COVID. So some 2018 accomplishments, again, just some highlights here is really working on incorporating the mission, vision, and values, more than just having officers memorialize them for a promotional process. The new focus for more monthly performance standards were our mission, vision, and values, not self-reported stats. I've actually heard officers say that it was easier when we just had focused stats on how many tickets and reports you wrote. Now they have to focus on proactively, reducing crime through partnerships and teamwork. We continue to implement and refine lean processes for patrol. We now take witness statements via MP3 audio recordings, eliminating the need to complete handwritten statements. So exactly what the witness is saying is what's captured. We started ongoing security audits of the jail to include policy and procedure, updates with the review of the city attorney and outside counsel to ensure we're meeting best practices in our jail. So the last 17 and 18 were absolutely critical years in improving the structure of our department, working on recreating a culture and our mission, vision, and values. And in 2019, really was very much focused on Proposition 1 and implementing that was really our highest priority. That continues into 2020, as you know, takes a significant amount of time to recruit, hire, and train new officers so that experienced officers can take those specialty positions on Proposition 1. That proposition was to enhance police services and community safety, and it provided the department with a valuable community policing tool. PROACT is all about focusing on the interests of our community. In Kirkland, that really involves property crimes. Other communities, that's different. But we do really get a lot of complaints about mail theft and car prowls and vehicle theft, and our PROACT unit is able to follow up on those crimes and really focus on those kind of prolific criminals that are doing that across the region. The gun safety program is also a valuable opportunity for police officers to interact in the community in a completely neutral fashion that does not include enforcement activities. The school resource officers, I know they're a topic of conversation tonight, but they are absolutely a community policing program, not an enforcement program. That is not our goal. All of these allow us to build relationships and build trust. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about the SROs or the PROACT team, only to share that all of those officers have been hired to replace experienced officers that are now in those positions. The department implemented the school safety camera program with the help of an ad hoc committee involving Public Works, the Finance Department, and the court, and there's actually an update on the consent agenda tonight about that program. It started in October in September, and then September with a warning period in October, issuing violations, and unfortunately in March when school stopped, we closed that down. So in addition, there are also two historically commissioned positions within the department that were reclassified, and we hired civilians to complete that work. The administrative commander was previously a commissioned captain, and after Captain Bill Hamilton retired, we were able to reclassify that to a civilian that is responsible for most of the administrative duties and the civilian staff in the department. So really records personnel, the jail, evidence techs, she's our liaison with the finance department in developing and monitoring the budget, and much, much more. That's just a few of the things. I would also like to point out that we did a considerable amount of community outreach in 2019. Some of that was done with the assistance of City Manager Jim Lopez and his team to really discuss with members of the community what they want from the department and community policing. We also are involved in the Welcoming Kirkland initiative. And really the essence of community policing is about working with the community to prevent crime. Problem solving and creating partnerships, it's also a priority for patrol. It's not just for the SROs or the NROs that are working with mental health professionals. So I just ask if there are any questions about our 2019 accomplishments. Again, these are some of the high-level overview.
Okay.
All right. So moving on to the 2020 priorities. And I want to say that these were all developed by staff in January, and that feels like it was a year ago. We had oversight as well from the city manager's office, but the outbreak of COVID-19 significantly delayed many of these projects. The Basic Law Enforcement Academy was closed. Command staff members were assigned to the Emergency Operations Center for almost 2 full months, and the focus shifted to ensuring the health and safety of the workforce. The department has not returned to normal operations, nor has the rest of city government or any of our lives, as you know. But we continue to implement Proposition 1. The mental health professional started on July 1st. Our second neighborhood resource officer will transition out of her current position and start on August 1st. And we have a crime analyst that's just finishing her background, just polygraph, psych, and medical. So the final, she's got a conditional job offer and is an experienced crime analyst. We are continuing to conduct community outreach. It's also a priority. It continues during COVID, but it's certainly taking a different form as we participate in virtual neighborhood meetings and are now trying to develop a gun safety program that can be completed in a similar manner. So we have by no means completed all of the recommendations in this plan. There's certainly a lot of work to be done, and there are new projects that come up all the time and that were never considered in 2016. But this is still a focus for the department, and it's still a city council work plan. So just see if there's any questions. Councilmember Falcone. Yes.
Thank you, Chief. Thanks for that great update. I'm really excited to hear that we've hired a mental health professional. So congratulations, and I'm really excited for that. I think that's a really important step in making sure that those who have the most appropriate skill set are really responding to those mental health emergency calls that we know we receive so many of here. I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit more about what that position will look like. I've had some questions from community members around, will that person be wearing a uniform? Will that person have any weapons? What kind of vehicle will that person be responding to? So can you speak a little bit about what that position will look like to the public?
Sure. So this is a little bit higher level position than our current mental health professionals that are working as co-responders with police officers. So we received on July 1st another grant from WASPIC, the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, to continue to use the co-responder model. So this is a little bit higher level in trying to coordinate with more directly with Leslie Miller in Human Services and with Community Services in Kirkland, actually service providers, and focusing on persons experiencing homelessness and providing services there. And then as the fire department also has Medic One levy dollars to implement a program, some coordination there as well. So this is a position that is not a uniform position. It's a civilian. We have polo shirts and slacks. While they may respond with a police officer, there may be times where they're also just driving a city vehicle, pool vehicle as well. Did I hit all of those questions?
You did, yes. Can you also elaborate on when this person will be available to respond to calls and like how quickly they'll respond to calls? And is it only during the work week, during the business hours, during Monday through Friday, or is it 24/7? Can you speak to that as well?
So for the most part, routine calls would be during business hours, but the person that's filling this role has also previously acted as a co-responder. So is also an instructor at the State Academy in Crisis Intervention Training, so the 8 hours that we're all required to take. She teaches the 8, the 40, and several other classes as well. So she's very used to other than business hours as far as it goes in working with police departments. So aside from being available when we need her, yeah, she would respond in an emergency. Or if there's only the good time to contact someone that is in crisis is in the evening, she would do that as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Chief.
Super, thank you. Okay, before I call on council members who are waiting to speak, I just want to mention to the audience on Zoom that this is a council study session. So this is our opportunity to learn about the progress of some of the projects that we are watching, and it is not a time for public comment. So if you would lower your hands until we ask you to provide comment in the audience participation processes that are coming up, that would be great. And I've got Councilmember Curtis.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Chief. Thank you for your progressive leadership and building a police department that we all can be proud of. As you said, this is a really challenging year, and I want you to know that I have confidence in your leadership during this transformative time. So thank you for being there. I've read the police strategic plan in the past, but this weekend's review was very different because it was a different lens I was looking at it. And there were a couple things, a couple recommendations that came forward that I'm like, why didn't we do that? And two of them were recommendation 21, which was suggest community advisory groups with a focus on representing different groups, racial and ethnic groups, sexual identity groups, religious denominations groups. And that one didn't make it to our spreadsheet for tracking. So I'm curious about that. And the other one that came out to me was recommendation 30, which talked about monitoring the justice system on minorities and tracking that also. So can you talk about why those didn't make the spreadsheet?
So I sure hope that I'm not messing this all up right here. All of the recommendations should be on this spreadsheet, and I printed it out.
I will be honest with you, it was so tiny, and I searched over and over again, so they could have been.
Yeah, so what it doesn't include, it includes the 21 and what it says in 21, and it includes A and B, the subsections, but it doesn't include all of the narrative on that section. And I fully support having community advisory groups. I have many of my peers have community advisory groups. When I started as a chief, I will tell you that my go-to advisory group were that community panel that had been part of the selection process. So there were many times that I would call Mary Alice or I would call Jawad and ask them for advice. And we definitely in A, subsection A, we definitely have had ad hoc groups that arise out of topical issues of interest to the community and the department. That has definitely happened. I do support having more structured advisory groups. I think it's a great way, again, to build relationship and get notable people in our community to understand what our policies are, what our procedures are, and how we do things, and then provide input and say, just like you all do, and when you say, I saw this on Facebook or I heard about it, and you ask me to look into it, it's further reaching as well.
Yeah.
So I do support that. 30, I think is going to take some work. And while as I had said earlier, definitely in 17 and 18, a lot of the work, that we did was on the structure of our department and rebuilding some of our mission, vision, and values. I'm a brand new chief, and so learning the system that the city has and how to get things successfully through the city manager to the city council to get approved. I mean, there was a lot of that work occurring as well. But this actually is about us engaging all of you, the city policymakers, right, and determining what level of detail and how much data you want to collect and analyze and report. and only data that will be used should be gathered. This will require modifying forms and records templates to gather additional data and demand time from officers, as well as the records and crime analysis unit. Each data point collected will add time to each police encounter to collect and input the information, and new forms will likely create large amounts of data that will need to be analyzed, stored, and managed. So that's absolutely, I mean, it's a bit of an undertaking, but something we can do. And this is absolutely off the top of my head. One of my concerns is that it means that we might be asking people what their race is, what their life preferences are, or guessing. So it's a bigger discussion for sure. And but I think it's something that I agree with the consultants in that we should be engaging the city policymakers to ensure they support what we're doing.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. And the data gathering is something we'll talk about more when we talk about the dashboard and when we go to our public hearing. So thank you for those responses.
Thank you. Councilmember Pascal.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Sherry, obviously a ton of work has been done over the last number of years, and you just have to look at the list of accomplishments. And of course, for those detail-oriented people, the small print spreadsheet at the end of the packet, which has some really good information, but it's a lot to wade through. A couple of things I wanted to follow up on from Councilmember Falcone's question was around the mental health professional. So I'm glad that you talked a little bit about that. We've had the mid funding for a year or two now, where we've had a part-time professional working alongside our neighborhood resource officer. And now we have essentially a full-time professional combined with, it sounds like, with some ongoing mid funding that will have another person as well. Is that how I understand it correctly? I wasn't quite clear on that.
So there is actually mid funding that is good through the end of this year. And that is a collaborative effort with 4 other agencies: Bothell, Lake Forest Park, Shoreline, and Kenmore. And so we are good for the rest of this year, and we're right now making budget presentations to county council members about next year.
Okay.
And there are multiple co-responders, navigators, mental health professionals in that program. In addition to that, the state, the sheriff and police chiefs gave us a grant to also provide contract mental health professional services in a co-responder capacity. So we're doing that as well. Okay,
that's good. That's good to understand, because it's not, I mean, I wasn't completely clear on all the different resources. And I guess the concern that I have as a council member in Kirkland is that because now that we've hired a full-time mental health professional, that those other shared resources might be diverted elsewhere, because we stepped up and rightfully funded a full-time one. So that's just a concern I have, and I'd be curious to see how that works out. I mean, obviously we want to be regional partners and make sure that the resources are directed where they're most needed. But that's just something that I think would be good to track, perhaps, through the end of the year. The other thing is that you touched on a little bit, that you're saying that the mental health professional might respond without an officer. And that's good to hear, because that's something that I've been thinking about for a while now, is that there's often going to be times where you don't want an officer necessarily along for that call, right? The mental health professional could perhaps take that on themselves, just by developing the relationships over time and knowing that person that they're talking with. So do we have protocols and policies and things in place to kind of better figure that out and make sure that we're being consistent and that we're being flexible and that we're kind of, just kind of being very thoughtful about how we approach that?
We don't currently have policies, procedures, or protocols for them to respond on their own. When I mentioned that, I was mostly talking about when they're coordinating their efforts with other service providers, when they're, doing out contacts with human services, but they won't be responding to an incident or a call on their own. Right now, there are many times that the navigators, mental health professionals, make phone calls to those in crisis as follow-ups, but they're not going out by themselves to make contact with them in the field. So that is not something that we currently have any protocol for now.
Okay. All right. I misunderstood. Thanks for clarifying that.
And I've got one more question from Deputy Mayor Arnold.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Chief, it is great news to hear that we've got this mental health professional starting work this month. It's the kind of proactive leadership that we're hearing a lot about today in the conversations about saying, how do we get a new type of first responder? And because of your vision and follow through, we're already doing this. It may be a program that we want to expand, and I'm wondering how quickly we can do an evaluation of how things are working. Because ideally, if we could come back in 3 months to hear how this is going, it would help inform our budget decisions this year. If this is something we wanted to do more of, or accelerate, or adjust. We've got other resources through WASPIC and mid-funding, but this may be something that we want to adjust funding for as well.
Yeah, and I would just say that we've done actually recently and really in the last month quite a bit of research on what other programs are out there that don't involve police officers. And Debbie Lacey and I actually have exchanged some emails about programs that supplement current co-responder programs, one of which is in Eugene. It's called Cahoots. And there was an article that Debbie had sent about Denver also, Police Department also looking at doing that as well. And those are all programs that are supplementing. Cahoots is actually a medic that responds. So again, this is something that we may very well be in a fantastic position to implement based on the Medic One levy, our own current project. We have fairly consistent data since 2018 and first receiving the WASPIC grant on the number of contacts that we have in the field and that we're using mental health professionals on. So we have to report all of that for the grant. So there's already a lot of information available there, and we continue to track it. I do want to say that Deputy City Manager Tracy Dunlap is also involved. This is not just a police department mental health professional. So we've had this ad hoc committee in which Tracy is overseeing to ensure that this program is a little bit higher level than what we're doing with MID or WASPIC. So I don't think it would take a lot to adjust it in any direction that it needs to go. I will say that I'm a huge advocate for co-responders with police officers. Most of the time, you're not, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but people are not calling 911 because they want to tell you good things. And most people that are really in crisis are not calling 911 either. It's a family member or someone who's a witness. And so it's been an incredible program for us. It's like having a mental health instructor in the car with you as well. They model de-escalation and communication tactics with police officers. So I would continue to advocate for our current co-responder program, but I think that there are a lot of ways to enhance what we currently do.
Super, thank you, Sherry. So are you ready to move on to the use of force policy update?
Okay. So I think we just need a second to change slides and possibly change speakers.
Get my notes right.
So while the chief is doing that, I want to remind people there's also an element of the Medic One levy, the fire EMS Medic One levy, that is also allocated back to jurisdictions for similar kind of mental health programs on the fire side. So one of the reasons we created the ad hoc group led by the deputy city manager was to make sure that we have all of those elements coordinated, the grant, our program, and the Medic One program to make sure that, just as Councilmember Pascal said, that we're not instead of these regional grants, but in addition to these regional grants. So we're trying to figure out how to factor that money in as well. It just started this year. So again, a lot of this was supposed to be ready in the first quarter of this year, and it all sort of got pushed back a little bit by the COVID crisis, but it's definitely going to be catching steam in the second half of the year. All right, so this next one, we actually forgot about the second half, is as a two-parter. So it's use of force, then we did add a small update on the use of body-worn cameras. That was a question council members had asked us to bring back as well, so I will touch on that briefly at the end of this presentation. So once again, Chief, take it away.
I really want to thank you for the opportunity to provide a high level of overview of some of the department's use of force policies and the status of body-worn camera research that was requested back in May. I have 13 slides for this discussion on the use of force, but I promise I'll do my best to move quickly. I'm also going to have staff that are here to answer any of your questions, and Deputy Chief Todd Axtell will take one of these slides as he's been a use of force instructor. And I just want to also say that in the staff memo, I had indicated that the Kirkland Police Department recognizes the need to continuously adapt to the needs of our community. The men and women of the department are absolutely centered on the sanctity of human life. It's important to ensure our policies, our procedures, and our training are in line with that principle and that we maintain the public trust. The department has received a number of comments, questions, and recommendations involving use of force policies. And to ensure policies and procedures are in line with best practice, staff have consulted the recommendations contained in the following publications that I've listed on this slide. And that's only a few of them. There are actually quite a few more that are on my desks and the desks of the deputy chiefs of current reading. Many of our contacts, like I said earlier, with the public are when they are experiencing conflict. Not many people, again, call 911 to report a positive event. They are calling to report an emergency. The quote on this slide is important to recognize that we understand the use of force is a matter of critical concern. There are days in which a police officer handles a number of routine calls, and then there are days in which officers respond to calls that involve persons in crisis who only need immediate medical attention, and the use of reasonable force is the only way to get that person to a hospital. Officers also deserve to go home at night unharmed. While they know the dangers of this job that they signed up for, none of us want to hurt anyone, and none of us want to be hurt. The bottom bullet on this slide, the department recognizes and respects the value of all human life and dignity without prejudice to anyone. Vesting officers with the authority to use reasonable force and protect the public welfare requires monitoring, evaluation, and careful balancing of all interests. And that's a quote from our policy manual. So the use of force policies, procedures, and training are all centered on the law. The revised Code of Washington, and I might call it an RCW in this presentation tonight, provides the definition of necessary, and it's something that's memorized by every academy recruit. The U.S. Supreme Court decisions in Tennessee versus Gardner and Graham versus Connor are the foundation of all police training, policies, and procedures. They're the standards that we're held to. They're the cases that provide a lens in which federal judges examine the actions of our officers when there's a use of force complaint, a Title 1983, that goes to federal court. So most people in our society, they don't like the sight of physical altercation, and they would not willingly participate in trying to hurt someone. I've been in law enforcement for 27 years, and the sight of people that have been injured and hurt, DV victims with black eyes and split lips, that still makes me sick to my stomach after 27 years. Many of our encounters are just routine, as I said before, and many are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. We teach officers to assess the factors that are listed under Graham versus Connor. What is the crime that is being committed? the immediate threat to the officer or others, and whether or not this suspect is even resisting or attempting to flee. Throughout all of this training is ethical decision-making too. Just because you could use force in any given situation, do you need to? Is it the right thing to do? The definition of force is the application of physical techniques or tactics, chemical agents or weapons to another person. It is not a use of force when a person allows himself or herself to be searched, escorted, handcuffed, or restrained. And I've had a lot of questions from community members about why we don't record the number of times we handcuff someone, and that is not considered a use of force by the courts. So that is not something that we currently record. So I previously worked in a smaller police department that did not have the funds to purchase a gold standard policy manual like Kirkland has. In that department, we had operations orders, which you might call SOPs. We had special orders that would expire and were temporary in nature. We had training bulletins that also gave direction to procedures, and they were all in big 3-ring binders that were located in the chief's office. We also had another set that was located in the patrol bay, and how those policies were updated often entailed someone hearing of a new technique or program while they were attending training, and we would call around to other departments and see what they were doing and edit our big binders. I learned a lot from that department, but I have to say that I married up when I came to Kirkland in 2012. The then Lieutenant St. Jean, who is behind me, was working on implementing what's called the Lexipol Policy Manual. This is a nationally known law enforcement, EMS, fire, and correction manual that represents the cutting-edge best practice of national police practices. Policies are written by subject matter experts and vetted by attorneys. Updates are provided on an ongoing basis that align with state and federal laws. When the state passed new laws last year about firearms and domestic violence, we didn't have to poll our neighboring agencies on how they were going to write a new policy. We received an electronic update from Lexipol based on the new law passed by the legislature. When a recent state law on impounding vehicles after a DUI arrest was overturned by the courts, we received that same update from Lexipol. Those updates are pushed out on an electronic platform, and officers are required to read and confirm every change in policy. The policy is available on their cell phone, and they can access it on any computer. They don't have to go back to the department and look in a 3-ring binder. In addition, Lexipol provides daily training bulletins that help understand and apply policies. And I wanted to show you a scenario, an example of a daily training bulletin that was published to the department in February. And yes, even the chief of police is responsible for completing these. This scenario involves 2 officers responding to a suspicious complaint in which the reporting party can see a flashlight moving in their neighbor's house who is on vacation. As the officer investigates further, a subject runs from the house and begins climbing a chain link fence to escape. One of the officers yells, "Stop or I'll shoot." The other officer does not see anything in the suspect's hands or their waistband, and he appears to be unarmed. Is the officer authorized to apply deadly force in this situation? Lexipol then provides the department policy for the use of deadly force, and this is consistent with the federal case I talked about earlier, Tennessee versus Garner. There's a brief analysis, which is reasonable to believe that the suspect was likely committing a felony. There are no facts to suggest or believe that the felony he committed involved serious bodily injury or death. And additionally, there is no reason to believe the suspect is armed or otherwise poses an imminent risk of death or serious physical injury to any other person if he is not immediately apprehended. You don't shoot. You let him go. You might chase him, but you don't shoot. The conclusion, again, is that this is not a deadly force situation. So to complete this daily training bulletin, you also have to take a quiz. And if you don't get it right, it won't let you finish until you do. And so just wanted to give you a little update. We publish these every month. They come from Lexipol, and typically they're a very wide range of policy questions. So I'd like to focus the next part of my presentation on the many emails that you all received regarding the 8 Can't Wait campaign. The department's policy manual is now posted on the city website for anyone to access, as well as a list of frequently asked questions to provide an overview of what use of force techniques are authorized in Kirkland based on the 8 Can't Wait premise. I first contacted the 8 Can't Wait campaign on June 22nd with a request to review those FAQs and their recommendations on our language. We did not receive a response. We altered some of those FAQs based on language that they had on their website when we actually submitted our policies and procedures, but have never gotten any kind of response. The website no longer allows a department to submit policies for review, but it now includes a link to a website called Muckrock that provides a form letter records disclosure request for use of force incidents and complaints. And it actually lists the city clerk as Kathy Anderson and has her email address and appears as, it's got a bunch of form letter language to request police use of force complaints and policies. There's already been one request made, and Kathy's looking at me like I know a secret, but there's already been one request made by a person who's also requested from departments in Oklahoma, Georgia, North Carolina, California, and Minnesota. So while we didn't ever receive a response from 8 Can't Wait, we believe that we're in compliance with the following areas of concern. And I've listed all of those on one slide, and I'm going to go into a little bit more depth into the other areas that are not an easy yes. So we have an entire chapter on crisis intervention and de-escalation. And based on our policy review when we were creating the FAQs, we also added additional language on de-escalation to the chapter on use of force to reinforce that de-escalation should be used. Those tactics should be used in order to reduce the need for force when it's safe to do so. So we added that language to our actual chapter 300 on use of force policies. In addition to requiring warnings, we also require warnings before we deploy a taser or a control device. I will say that there are circumstances when that isn't possible, and the policy does recognize that. We require officers to intervene and promptly report any incidents in which the level of force being used was not reasonable. I've seen examples since I've worked here in Kirkland of officers doing that very thing. All force, to include even pointing a taser or a firearm at a person, is required to be reported, and higher levels of force are further scrutinized through a formal board of review. So there are certain cases, such as an officer-involved shooting or an in-custody death, that an outside agency is requested to conduct an independent investigation. So the next slide, I'm going to actually ask Deputy Chief Axtell to speak on this slide. We don't train our officers to restrict anyone's airway, but we have trained them to utilize a carotid control hold for many years. I want to emphasize that our ultimate goal in any encounter is to avoid and minimize injury to all. So I'm asking Todd to take the slide because he was a defensive tactics instructor earlier in his career. He is very well versed in this topic. He has had it done to himself a number of times. And so I'll just ask him to come up and speak to it.
Todd.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and members of council. Thank you for giving me a few minutes of your time. I haven't had a chance to meet some of you. My name is Todd Axtell. I'm the current Deputy Chief of Operations for the Kirkland Police Department. I've had the pleasure of working for Kirkland for almost 24 years. And during most of that time, I've been involved in both teaching and reviewing use of force by the Kirkland Police Department. I take a few minutes to just talk about vascular neck restraints and how we've used them in the past. Kirkland Police Department began using vascular neck restraints in 2003. Vascular neck restraints work by partially restricting blood flow to and from the brain. Officers are taught to apply pressure on the sides of the neck while avoiding putting pressure on the front of the neck, Want to avoid putting any strain on the trachea, the larynx, or the hyoid bone. People maintain the ability to breathe while a vascular neck restraint is being applied to them. The purpose of the neck restraint is not to render all people unconscious, but to overcome violent resistance with the minimum amount of compression necessary. Officers are taught to use 3 levels of compression, which we label minimum, moderate, and maximum. Compression increases as resistance increases, and officers learn to immediately release compression once resistance ceases. They release to what's called level 1 minus, which is a position of control where they maintain the position but there's no compression. People often stop resisting at level 1 minus with no need for compression at all. During a level 3 compression, or maximum, people lose consciousness in an average of 4 to 7 seconds and regain consciousness in an average of 25 seconds, under 25 seconds. If a person does not regain consciousness in 30 seconds, officers are trained to immediately transition to providing life-saving aid. Prior to changing our policy to define vascular neck restraints as lethal force, Kirkland officers received an initial 8 hours of certification training, followed by an additional 4 hours of recertification training annually. Each session included policy review, case law review, and hands-on practice of approved techniques. Each officer had to pass both a written and a skills test each year in order to remain certified. Approved neck restraint techniques could only be used by officers who were currently certified, and during the training and testing, officers applied neck restraints to each other repeatedly. During the 17 years that the Kirkland Police Department used vascular neck restraints, there were no serious injuries in training or field applications. The revised Code of Washington that the Chief showed earlier defines deadly force as the intentional application of force through the use of firearms or any other means reasonably likely to cause death or serious physical injury. Vascular neck restraints simply do not fit that definition of lethal force. If they did, officers would not be able to apply vascular neck restraints on each other in a training environment. Kirkland officers have used vascular neck restraints to safely resolve multiple violent and dangerous situations where other uses of force, such as taser and pepper spray, and striking with fists, elbows, and knees, had failed prior to the application of the neck restraint. In a sample case, officers were dispatched to a domestic disturbance call after a woman reported that there was a naked male sitting on her porch. While on the phone with 911, she yelled for help and stated that she feared that she would be killed and that there was a .38 revolver in her residence. Officers arrived and contacted the still naked male in the doorway of the residence. The male was mumbling incoherently and resisted officers' attempts to control him by trying to pull away and flee further into the residence. He continued to yell at officers and fought against their attempts to control him. During the struggle, officers tried OC spray, multiple taser applications with no effect. They then attempted strikes to the male in his chest and legs with fists, knees, and feet, also with no effect. An officer was able to apply a vascular neck restraint and rendered the male unconscious. Once unconscious, officers were able to handcuff the male without further incident. The male regained consciousness in about 5 to 15 seconds. He was treated at the scene by aid and transported to Harborview Hospital, where he was involuntarily committed. The male needed to be decontaminated for the pepper spray exposure and sustained a small cut on his nose. Without the availability of vascular neck restraints, officers in similar situations will likely have to escalate to the use of their batons, additional striking, or firearms. All of these options have a higher potential for serious injury or death than vascular neck restraints. An unintended consequence of labeling vascular neck restraints as lethal force is that it may lead to higher levels of force being used, resulting in more significant injuries to officers and to suspects. Do you have any questions for me on neck restraints? Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Sure. Do you want to maybe just cover that bottom bullet point, though, to make sure that's emphasized?
I do. And I started this use of force presentation saying that the department recognizes the need to adapt to the community. And after receiving the A Can't Wait emails and communication from our community, we changed the department policy on the use of carotid controls, first to a higher level of force, but have since indicated that it can only be used in a deadly force situation. And so most likely we will be discontinuing the training of this technique, and we'll use those training hours to train defensive tactics in other ways. This is a very emotional issue, and we have initially come at it very fact-based about how we've used it, and for the most part, it's a tool that can be used when someone is experiencing excited delirium, and we can get them to medical aid. But this isn't a fact-based time. This is a very emotional issue, and we recognize that, and we've made this change. And also, the president put that out in an executive order as well, that we'd have some issues with federal grants if we continued to do this. So, good? Okay, so now, as I indicated in the staff memo, exhausting all alternatives before shooting is not always an option based on the facts and circumstances that an officer is presented with. Such as an armed subject who is actively attempting to seriously injure or murder someone. The entire use of force policy is based on the concept that force must be reasonable and necessary. There are a significant list of factors to consider in determining if force is necessary, and I won't go through all of them, but I provided a few in the staff memo. It's really, the officer's training, the crime at hand, the suspect's size, the officer's size. Are you able to control the person? They have more skill than you do? There's a lot of factors. There's a long list in our policy manual, but those are just a few. So this is not an easy yes or no answer. So does your policy, use of force policy, ban shooting at moving vehicles? And it doesn't expressly prohibit that, but it does direct officers to move out of the path of moving vehicles, and this is consistent with current case law. It's not like the movies. Officers can't jump in front of a car and start shooting. They are directed not to attempt to disable vehicles by shooting at them either. However, it is recognized that there could be instances in which there are no other alternatives than the use of a firearm to protect a person from a legitimate risk of serious injury or death. There have been examples of this situation around the country in which drivers purposely direct their vehicles at pedestrians and even protesters. So again, not an easy yes or no, but I said no. Does the department require a use of force continuum? And this is really something that is no longer taught in the basic law enforcement academy. While it was taught 27 years ago, in my basic law enforcement academy, law enforcement has moved away from that. It's not considered a best practice. In the example I gave of someone who's actively trying to assault or murder someone, the use of force that is reasonable in that scenario is based on the imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm to the victim. Utilizing a lower level of force is highly unlikely to stop someone that's conducting that type of assault. It wouldn't be reasonable to try and spray someone with OC spray, cap stun, pepper spray, who's seriously injuring someone else. The use of force continuum has also been used by defense attorneys to say, you have this in your policy that says you have to move through all of these techniques before you can use a higher level of force. And based on everything that I've just said, that's not always reasonable. So I know this is a lot of information. And again, I'm very thankful that you've allowed me the time to talk about the department. I also want to reinforce that aside from using the third-party policy manual, the department is also an accredited state agency that's required to meet 137 standards in 18 major law enforcement categories. This is not a rubber stamp. There are actually 266 police departments and sheriff's offices. There's like 39 sheriff's offices, but a total of 266 departments in the state, not including contract cities. And there are only 58 accredited agencies. I've been present when agencies, actually one of our neighbors that I won't but I won't name, but maybe somebody to the east, were denied their certification because they didn't meet their standards. Consistent with accreditation, the department policy and legislative action that was taken after I-940, we also utilize an outside agency to investigate deadly use of force incidents, and are currently working with our neighboring agencies and the King County Sheriff's Office to develop an independent investigation team of experienced detectives to conduct this work, and that's all based on I-940. So the department is compliant with all standards and collects proofs of compliance annually for inspection by WASPIC accreditation assessors every 4 years. We're actually up for accreditation assessment this year. The department review of use of force for the last 3 years is summarized on this slide. Now, this is very generic snapshot that I put together very quickly, but I wanted you to see how many calls for service officers respond to every year. The last 3 years are the only data I provided here, and the very low percentage of incidents that require any kind of use of force. There's also another layer of review that occurs by the King County Prosecutor's Office for criminal investigations, as far as criminal charging, and the King County Executive Office also conducts inquest hearings in all in-custody deaths involving law enforcement. So I guess for the record, and those that don't have video capabilities right now, in 2017, the department responded to 45,564 calls for service, and there were 95 incidents of use of force, which is a percentage of 0.2%, and we also had 2,040 arrests. And in 2018, there were 49,418 calls for service. We had 90 uses of force, and 0.18% percentage of those calls for service were use of force. There were 1,790 arrests that year. In 2019, we had 48,029 incidents, calls for service, and 99 uses of force, which is, again, 0.2% of those calls for service, and we made 1,786 arrests. So, I turned the page too fast. So again, my previous slide was very generic snapshot of the department's use of force. There are other tools that can be utilized to expand the data and make it available to the public. The King County Sheriff's Office utilizes a private company to produce a use of force dashboard. It's very interactive and public-facing on their website. You can go on and look at the last 5 years and see how often they used any certain type of control technique, what the gender or race of the suspect was, or the police officer. So I assigned our new civilian commander, Melissa Petrichor, to contact that company and request a quote to develop something similar in Kirkland. That quote totaled $60,000 over 3 years, just shy of that. So Melissa noticed that the software utilized by the private company was a local Kirkland business and ordered a 2-week trial copy. And she produced what you're seeing here on this slide. And so Melissa is in the audience here, back to my left. You can't see her, but she's incredible. So this use of force dashboard will allow anyone to look at the last 5 years of data and, again, search the race and gender of both the suspect and the officer, the reason for the use of force, the type of force used, and when it occurred. This is a very preliminary look at what we could produce and publish on our website to ensure transparency with our community. So we need to do some more research on this project. I think the license is affordable. It's like $800 a user. So I think it's something that we could publish if it's something that the council is interested in and the city manager's office approves as well. But I wanted to just bring you an example of what other departments are doing to be more public-facing on their use of force. So is there any questions?
Are you ready for questions, Sherry?
Sure.
Member Nixon has a question or comment.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Mayor and Chief. I just have a question for clarification on the use of neck holds. My understanding, and I just would like you to say if I've got this right, is that we have not absolutely prohibited the use of neck holds. We now consider it to be deadly force, basically equivalent to shooting someone. And there are circumstances in our policy under which officers are allowed to shoot someone, like if they're acting in a way that threatens the life or grave physical harm of the officer or somebody else. And so under the same circumstances in which the policy would allow an officer to shoot at someone, they would still be allowed to use a neck hold. And for example, if an officer was in hand-to-hand combat with someone who is trying to kill them, it seems to me that they're authorized to use any means necessary to prevent themselves from being killed, including using a neck hold. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Comments?
And I would say that in 300.3 of our policy manual under use of force, there is language in the policy that speaks to recognizing circumstances that may arise in which officers reasonably believe that it would be impractical or effective to use any of the tools, weapons, or methods provided by the department. Officers may find it more effective or reasonable to improvise a response to rapidly unfolding conditions that they are confronting. In such circumstances, the use of any improvised device or method must nevertheless be reasonable and utilized only to the degree that reasonably appears necessary to accomplish the legitimate law enforcement purpose.
Thank you for that.
Sherry, let's make sure that we talk about this particular program in the budget process.
Oh, the use of force dashboard? Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's very affordable. But...
Yeah, we'll have to talk to the city manager about
yes,
that.
ma'am.
So are we done with the use of force presentation?
We are.
Mr. Lopez, thank you very much, Sherry.
Oh, I have body cameras, though.
Oh, that's right, you do.
So close.
Quick body camera.
So I only have 4 slides, and it'll go quick because this is very preliminary research that we've conducted. I want to emphasize that this project would be a significant investment and would also be a change of working conditions that will require negotiations with the Guild. I did not include the entire state law on this slide, but wanted to ensure that you knew that the policies must be established prior to implementing a camera program. And what's missing is a very long list of considerations that must be covered in that policy to include when cameras are, and just a few of them, cameras are activated and deactivated, how is the use of cameras documented, training on the use of cameras, how and under what circumstances an officer is to inform a member of the public that he or she is being recorded, including in situations where the person is a non-English speaker or has limited English proficiency, or the person is deaf or hard of hearing, and the list goes on. So the second state law strongly encourages a city to adopt an ordinance or resolution authorizing body-worn cameras prior to use by law enforcement and suggests that the city should include the community in the process of developing operational policies. So that right there would be fantastic with Deputy City Manager, Assistant City Manager Jim Lopez, who is behind me, in doing community outreach, but that would definitely take some time. So the department has had assistance from our shared intern, Heidi Brown, who also assists the city attorney's office and is a law school student. Heidi's been poring over body-worn camera studies and providing a brief list of the common perceived benefits to include increased accountability and transparency, higher rates of community compliance and fewer complaints, faster resolution of complaints, corroborating evidence as well as both in the defense and the prosecution of a crime, and being able to assess videos, incidents could be a really important training tool in looking at them after an incident. Some of the perceived concerns in body-worn cameras that Heidi has noted is absolutely the cost of the program and certainly the time it takes to process video as evidence of a crime and public disclosure. There are potentially privacy issues and considerations for victims and those who might be disproportionately impacted by cameras. There's also a human factor in just returning and remembering to turn it on, but also in understanding that the camera isn't always seeing what the officer may be looking at, and that the frame rate of a camera in certain instances may be moving faster than the officer can see, or that their brain can even process what's happening. She has shared that there's also some conflicting studies that show some programs offered no significant change, while some did. These are really a tool, but they still need the officer wearing them to serve and protect our community with integrity, honor, and courage. This is a very preliminary estimate on the cost. We have not done an RFP. We just asked vendors for rough quotes. The Redmond Police Department just provided a similar presentation to their committee on the whole, and while their cost for cameras is lower as they have less officers, they also agreed with the need for additional full-time employees to handle the PDRs and the evidence. So you can see that the first year, the cost with staff and the initial setup of the cameras is about $500,000. And then there's ongoing costs after that that are very close to that as well. So this is incredibly preliminary. The Kent Police Department deploys 100 cameras, so they're pretty close to our size. So we are looking at other departments and what are their programs and what are their costs and what are they doing. But very, very preliminary. And I think it's a September due date to have more research and a white paper back to you. So I want to thank you very much for your time. You have a very good police department, and it's a good police department because of the men and women that work there. This has been a whirlwind for us too. And I just, remembering during COVID when no one would take a day off, they all came to work because they wanted to help in the crisis. And they still want to help in this current crisis as well, in building relationships and trust in our community. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sherry. Great report. Council, any other discussion? We welcome Mr. Lopez.
I see Councilmember Black has a question.
Go ahead, Councilmember Black.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Chief. One quick question on the follow-up question on the body cameras. In the 2016 Burke report, one of the recommendations was that we examine the results of body cam pilots in our neighboring cities. And I don't have it in front of me, but I believe the Burke report had a list of the cities that at that time were actually neighboring cities of ours that were actually doing body cam pilots. Have we not just evaluating the cost, which I realize we're sort of in the preliminary stages of, but also you had a couple of slides on the pros and the cons. Do we have empirical data from our neighboring cities, or is that on our work plan to develop or to engage with those neighboring cities that have pilot programs?
Yes.
And find out what their experiences is with respect to those lists of pros and those lists of cons?
Yes, so just again, rough estimates. Seattle has implemented, we all know Seattle has implemented body-worn cameras, but also the Bellingham Police Department did a pilot program, and now all uniform officers, it's mandatory that they read it or they wear them. Kent did a limited pilot program, and again, like I said, they have 100 officers, and they're all wearing them. Everett did a pilot program. They initially just had 10 officers with cameras, and they have the budget to do it to implement those in 2020. So Tukwila did a pilot program in 2016, and they now have 70 officers that are wearing those. So we have identified those departments that have done the pilots, and we'll absolutely be working with them to find as much information as we can. But I think an important thing to remember is also the community outreach that needs to be conducted too.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Sherry.
So just check in with the council. This last presentation is probably about 25 minutes to half an hour. So is the council okay with going to about 7:15 to finish this topic?
Council, does that work? Okay, great.
And some thumbs up, and thank you, MJ and Debbie, for your patience. So, as I said, we have a bit of a substitute teacher filling in. David is here in case we need to call him in an emergency, but is not feeling so well, and Jim is going to give his presentation. I'm going to chime in as one of the co-chairs of this task force. As I said, we have two of the members of the task force here, and I think as most of you know, Councilmember Falcone started off as a task force member, as a Human Services Commissioner, but then got elected to the council and transitioned that to David Godfrey from the Human Services Commission. So I want to say one more thing before the Assistant City Manager jumps in, which was we have some questions since many people are seeing this for the first time. This task force was created back before Proposition 1, and the concept was assumed that school resource officers program existed. So what we're looking at is the task force mission was to say, how do we keep the program working at best practices and making sure it doesn't have any bad outcomes. The intent of the task force was not to say should there or should there not be school resource officers. So just a comment for the public because we've been getting some of those questions. So with that as an overview, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jim Lopez.
Thank you very much, City Manager, Madam Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and Council. It's a pleasure to be before you tonight. I will be joined tonight by Debbie Lacey from the Eastside Refugee and Immigrant Coalition. I see you there, Debbie. And MJ Carlson from Individual Kirkland. Hi, MJ. Thank you both very much for participating in the presentation tonight. We're going to move through, and I'll kind of signal for your slides as we plan, but please, both of you, feel free to jump in and we can chat as we move through this presentation. We now have, I think, a little bit more time, so thank you, Kurt and Council, and we want to be as responsive as we can, Council, to answer the questions tonight. So this is about the School Resource Officer Task Force and the recommendations of that task force. Let's see. We got a little issue here. We're having a little bit of a technical problem. Oh, got it. Thank you, buddy. So we're going to go through 4 sections. Well, first we'll talk about the overview of the process. We'll talk about a very important piece of legislation, RCW 28A 32124, and yes, that is a mouthful. We'll talk about the actual task force recommendations and then a little bit about next steps. Tonight we have 25 slides and we'll move through expeditiously, but please stop and ask questions as we move through the deck. So the purpose of the task force, as evidenced by R 5339, our resolution, is to become educated on the current SRO program, to compare the program with national best practices, to make recommendations for improvements to the program, to the city and the school district. Importantly, this resolution affirmed the city's intent for the SRO program, i.e., what the program is intended to do. As the city manager mentioned, this task force was not designed to ask the question of whether or not we should have a school resource officer program. It is really about the intent, design, and I think as Debbie is going to talk about in some detail, the purpose of the program, of the SRO program. So let me turn it over here to MJ, and you could perhaps take us through the summary of the task force meetings. Oh, I'm sorry. We met from June of 2019 through January of this year. January of this year seems like 5 years ago when you think about it. We also did some additional stakeholder interviews after January. And we've asked MJ to come and present a little bit about the makeup of the task force and some of the initial challenges that the task force faced. Over to you, MJ.
All right, thank you. And good evening, everyone. I want to start by reinforcing what was just said, that this task force was looking at improvements to the program already having been approved and in the process of implementation. So there were some best practices that were sort of off the table for us. There are a lot of organizations like the ACLU and Dignity in Schools that say the best practice is not to have SROs, and that was not part of our consideration. So we focused just on how we could improve the existing program. And also in terms of the timeline that Jim went over, to reinforce that this all happened not just before COVID, but before George Floyd's death put this issue in the spotlight again. So in some degree, we're ahead of the curve because we were looking at sort of the racial impact of this program before it became so much in the public spotlight again. But this was not in response to how the conversation has moved since then from the 8 can't wait towards the 8 to abolish. So on this slide, let's see, the task force had members from a lot of organizations. Obviously, there were people from the city and the police and from the school district. But then Debbie Lacey joined it from the Eastside Refugee and Immigrant Coalition. NAACP was invited to join. I don't believe we ever had anyone from them.
No.
I was there from Indivisible. We had a couple people from the Human Services Commission as Councilmember Falcone switched out. We had members from the Youth Council and from the PTSA. But then after the June meeting, the reason that there was such a long space of time between the June meeting and the October meeting was that we realized in June that the room really did not reflect the whole community. And in particular, there were at that point no Black community members represented, no immigrant community members, and so on. And a lot of the groups that we were really concerned about that national research has shown that SRO programs can have disparate negative impact on, those folks weren't in the room. So we took a break and tried to rethink the makeup of the council a little and ended up inviting more folks, especially from the Lake Washington School District Equity Team. So when we came back together in October, we were joined by Gloria Henderson from that team. And then we also had a number of members, Diana, Nihal, Derek, Al, who came through temporarily, I guess, for one meeting or more. So the main members of the meeting who were there for the entire process were still that first group that I mentioned, but we did get small amounts of input from other community members as we went. I still think, we need to think as a city about whether that was adequate or whether there needs to be more. In particular, I'd point out we never got feedback from Black students or immigrant students or other highly impacted groups. There wasn't anyone on our committee who was a teacher or school counselor, which I point out because the local teachers union has since come out against SRO programs. So that certainly was not a viewpoint that was considered. So I think it was a big learning process for all of us in terms of reaching out and having better representation. It was a fantastic experience to meet people from throughout the community and bring in those voices, but definitely still a growth area. And then in those remaining meetings, we went through recommendations. The city staff very kindly put together sort of a long list of recommendations from various sources, and we reviewed them together in groups and sort of switched up and reviewed each other's reviews and so on, and put it all together in the report, which hopefully you have received.
So thank you very much, MJ, and we will all be available for questions as we go throughout the presentation. In November and December, staff asked the task force member for groups or individuals to reach out for additional feedback, which the task force did. These are the organizations we reached out to. We didn't hear back from all of them. We did hear back from some, and we did do several interviews to supplement the research and outreach for the report. And the feedback was brought back to the December 18th meeting. So that's kind of a quick summary of the process behind the task force meetings, some of the challenges the task force faced, and how the task force deliberated about resolving some of those challenges. And then, importantly in the process, this legislation was passed at the state level. And the legislation codified made the work of the task force, it expedited the work significantly. Because several of the pieces of the legislation were very germane to the issues that the task force itself was evaluating. And those issues related to SRO training, the SRO program review involving the community, clear roles and responsibilities as it relates to school discipline. The legislation was very specific about this. Collection and reporting of data to guard against disparities and impact. The legislation opined on the required program contract elements with the school and the cities, and it outlined clear process for collecting and investigating complaints against SROs. This body of work, the task force recognized, would address many of the initial concerns. So the task force was able to focus their attention on additional recommendations, but beyond these core concerns. And those additional recommendations are the focus of Section 3 of our presentation. And these recommendations can really be created into 3 buckets. The first bucket is around the various authorizing documents. The authorizing documents were recognized by the task force as critical because here is where you outline the purpose and the mission of the SRO program, and this is the guidepost by which the program is evaluated. There are also several recommendations about the SRO program in general. I will talk about them. A lot of these general recommendations are about community engagement and the various ways that we can reach out and make sure people are involved in the ongoing oversight of the program, but also how the program may evolve into the future. And finally, there's a bucket of recommendations specific to the SRO experience and training, what the school resource officers must do to be compliant in their training and experience. So organized in these 3 buckets, we start with recommendation 1.1, which is to define a clear statement of purpose for the SRO program. That includes this language, to help keep students out of the criminal justice system. This was very important to the program, to the task force, as one key purpose of the SRO program. And Debbie, I'm going to ask you, please, to take it from here, and we've designed a specific slide for you to discuss some of the details of this important element.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Mayor Sweet, council members, and other staff present. Really appreciate the opportunity to co-present here. Thank you to MJ as well for the work that went into the task force. We had a lot of work ahead of us, and I'm pleased to be here to talk about this particular aspect of the recommendations. So while the RCW puts forth guidelines to create statewide consistency, as you know, it doesn't require districts to have an SRO program. If districts choose to have a program, the RCW does state that the agreement between the cities and the district and the police department, at minimum, has to outline the role of acknowledging that the role of a school resource officer is as a teacher, informal counselor, and law enforcement officer. This wasn't specific to our task force that we have on the slide here, but I just wanted to point out that those are the current state. That's the current state framework for the role of the SRO program. And I think it's important to name that. So first, you see the first bullet there. First and foremost, I would say that we understand that the purpose is to ensure student safety, physical, social, and emotional safety for students at school. Secondly, we had a conversation about this next one. Some stated that a possible purpose would be for the SROs to help build positive relationships between the police and youth. And we talked about the historical and current experiences that Black people and other people of color have had with police, namely the racial profiling, police brutality, and other experiences, of course, that we can all abhor and certainly condemn. However, a purpose that would set a goal as an expectation that SROs would build positive relationships between communities and the police would disregard those lived experiences for many and doesn't reflect necessarily the wishes and needs of all of our students and their families when it comes to the SRO program. So we did agree upon the SRO program having a purpose of providing for positive interactions between the SROs and the students, families, and community members in hopes that the police department overall would be more accessible, approachable to the community members. Thirdly, we, as knowledgeable resources, the SROs are in a position oftentimes, and this is one of the primary roles that they have held in schools, is to connect students and their families with supportive services and resources. Lastly, with the awareness of the reality of the school to prison pipeline that disproportionately impacts Black, Latinx, and Native American youth, even more so if they have an intersectional identity, like having a disability or identifying as LGBTQ. These disparities grow, and we felt it was important to explicitly name the expectation that the SRO's purpose is to help keep students out of the criminal justice system. We discussed the importance about having community conversations to come around how this will all come to be and how important that is to engage in these conversations. So that was another part of what we discussed. And the reason being is there can be such a disconnect, right, between what we state our purpose is and what the reality of a program is. So one example of this is that the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights put out a report in 2018 based on the 2015-2016 year nationally. They studied data from 96,000 schools, and they found that in that school year that although Black students made up only 15% of the student body, they accounted for 31% of arrests at school. So when we see that kind of huge gap, we need to make sure that we are really having some alignment between intent and impact, of course. And overall, we felt that between the new RCWs coming out and this task force's recommendations, that if the district continues to have the SRO program, and then more recently having expanded it to the Kirkland middle schools, that the additional training, the data collection, reporting guidelines, other measures would help ensure that the SRO program could fulfill these outlined purposes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Debbie. And I think this idea of alignment between intent and impact is a reoccurring theme throughout the recommendations of the task force. For example, in the next set of recommendations, to align authorization documents related to the SRO program to use a consistent purpose statement in roles and responsibilities, and to include future documents currently being developed by the State Superintendent's Office to update relevant authorizing documents, you will see in the recommendations the need to connect the formal documents that talk about these purpose statements and outlining the clear goals of the program, the need to align between the school district, the City of Kirkland, the Kirkland Police Department policies, even down to the level of the labor contracts and right into the job descriptions themselves. So I think the task force was very deliberative about their systems and holistic approach to aligning the work of the task force to all of the systems that are created around the school resource officer program. So moving to the second bucket, recommendations related to the SRO program in general, you'll see several recommendations very much in our bailiwick in the CMO with David Walbrick, who provided really wonderful staff support to this group. Thank you, David. It's really about communication materials to better introduce the SRO program to the school community, including potentially impacted community members, to find those community members and connect with them and get their feedback on the program. Iteratively. Recommendation 2.2 similarly was to meet with affinity groups, which are groups formed around a shared interest or common goal to learn about varied perspectives and experiences of students and families. A recommendation 2.3 is to formalize the community feedback requirement of the state statute with a particular focus on proactive outreach to potentially impacted community members. And recommendation 2.4, to explore ways for the SRO to be provided for information about student behavior intervention, plans for use in emergency response situations. And I have to say, one of the things that I have been personally most impressed with the work of our SROs is how deeply committed they are and knowledgeable they become about these types of needs and intervention plans for students. They really take the time to develop relationships with students at the schools. And this is a clear recommendation for this program to focus on those relationships so that the SROs have very specific information to make good decisions. Recommendation 2.5 to finish out this second bucket is to explore ways to regularly collect and report relevant data that indicates whether disparate and negative impacts are occurring for particular groups of students, including students of color, LGBTQ, plus students and students with disabilities. So very clear direction to connect with the community to and be very transparent about the performance of the program. Recommendation 2.6, and to evaluate mechanisms for feedback such as 360 or other similar evaluation tools that includes students, staff, and families, all of those folks that are impacted by the program. In the final bucket, recommendations related to the SRO experience and training. And very straightforward, I think we have a best practice program as I stand here, but it is very important to communicate and update training requirements and offerings for SROs to meet or exceed the expectations of the state statute, to maintain the current expectation of the National Association of SROs training for all SROs, and ensure SROs receive training on referring students to counseling and other services, kind of to play this role of a hub, a person that can navigate and provide essential services where needed for students. Kind of the path towards help and assistance, not the criminal justice system. Recommendation 3.4 is to maintain the current hiring requirement of a minimum of 2 years of experience as a commissioned police officer. Additionally, in the SRO job description, pursuant to the bargaining with the Police Guild, there's very specific language to consider replacing willingness and desire with demonstrated ability with respect to interactions with youth. So the task force really got into specifics on how to engineer the will of the task force into the best practices of the program. Recommendation 3.5 was to continue emphasizing retention of SROs through the current 5-year SRO assignment commitment, and I think this is a recognition of both the very high quality of our SRO program, as well as a recognition of the need to build relationships both with students, families, and faculty in the school districts. It's a core part of the success of the program. So having gone through the task force recommendations, and thank you so much, MJ and Debbie, the next steps of the task force will be to implement the recommendations, and in order to implement them, surely to involve multiple entities, including you, council, the school district, board of directors, Chief Harris, who has been a true leader in this topic, and the Police Guild, and of course others. I think the task force was very interested in continuing the involvement of community members and stakeholders as we move through the implementations and continue to learn and get feedback from the data and transparency that we produce about the program. And understand that some recommendations may be actionable relatively quickly, while others make time. But I think the whole idea is to act, learn, and improve. We also are going to continue to evaluate the state law and make sure we are complying with all recommendations with the state law. So thank you very much. And I would now turn it over to the council for Madam Mayor for questions.
Thank you, Jim. I think we start out with Councilmember Nixon.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Clearly, whether or not the SRO program should continue at all was outside the scope of this task force. And so my question is, when will we take up the question of whether the SRO program should be continued? And if so, in what context? I'm curious, for example, if we think that that inquiry is encompassed by Resolution 5434, which we'll be having a public hearing on tonight. Or perhaps do we think the school district board should decide first whether they wanted to continue, and then we follow them? I mean, it's kind of a joint responsibility. Mm-hmm. So what do you think about that?
So my response to that is really, those are questions for the council. So the school district basically contracts for the police service in the schools and pays for half, and the cities, choose whether or not to pay for half. So we would need the council say you wanted to look at that. Certainly the resolution that's in front of you is a place you could add an exploration of the SRO program to that resolution. I spoke to the new superintendent, John Holman, who just became the new superintendent as the previous superintendent, who was also a co-chair of this task force, left. The school district at the moment intends to continue the SRO program. So that's the feedback I've gotten from them. But I think it would be up to the council to decide you want to look at that. And then there could be any number of mechanisms by which we would do it, but really it would probably start with the school district because they provide school resource officers in all of the schools, all the high schools in Lake Washington School District, in Redmond, Kirkland, and Sammamish, as well as unincorporated King County. So it's a district-wide program, but individual cities have made different decisions about it.
Thank you. I guess we'll see what the public says during the hearing today.
If I could interject, I know that the school board at their last meeting read aloud a letter from, as I mentioned, the teachers union, which requested a lot more, training on diversity issues and so on. But one of the requests was to end the SRO program. The Washington Superintendent of Public Instruction has also recently gone on record saying that he does not want armed officers in schools. So that is something that, on all levels, people are continuing to work on. That's not his call, obviously. He was calling on the legislature to do that. I also will interject that Indivisible started a petition for people who want the SRO program removed from the school district, and it currently has 299 signatures. So I think there is reason to believe that we'll be sort of pushing forward in questioning the program at the school district level.
Thank you, MJ. Before I move on, I just want to comment that we didn't get here without an enormous amount of energy and enthusiasm from our community. And it's taken us a long time to get here. So any change in the way that we deliver these services is going to require an intense level of conversation with that self-same community that we were responding to. And that's just, I don't personally believe you simply take a program like this that we've worked so hard to develop at the request of the community and stop without a huge community conversation. And with that, I will turn it over to Councilmember Falcone.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And I agree. I was a part of that public process a few years ago when we were, the city was developing the language around the Proposition 1 and talking about community safety. And I participated in a focus group of, I think it was called the PTA Moms. And we, the majority of that group spoke out at the time against SROs. So I think there was kind of mixed community input even at the time as well, a couple of years ago. But I agree. I think this is something we should continue to engage the community in. I want to thank Jim and Debbie and MJ for presenting tonight, and really the whole SRO task force for all your hard work over the past year plus. I was so impressed by the just the level of participation, both by the city and the school district. There were really some top leadership in the room that was open to very honest conversations about this issue. So I just want to, thank and applaud the city and the school district for your efforts in receiving the feedback from the community that we needed to have this very real conversation. I want to thank Jim and Debbie and MJ for presenting tonight, and really the whole SRO task force. I'm getting an echo back of what I just said. Is that here?
Tony, could you turn your speaker off?
By the just the level of participation both by the city and the school district. I think it's coming from some of us. I'm mute and I still hear it.
Tony Levitt, I think you need to mute yourself there.
Tony, I think you might need to mute.
A technical problem. Amy, I don't think it's anything you did.
Okay, I think we're good. I don't hear it anymore. Anyway, so thank you to everyone who participated in that. As was mentioned, I had the honor of serving on the SRO task force before joining council earlier this year. And a few years ago, I honestly didn't really think much about police in schools, one way or the other. Although my oldest was attending our local public elementary school, which doesn't have SROs, honestly, I didn't think about it at all. And it's probably because of my white privilege that I didn't have to think much about it, right? Most of my interactions and my kids' interactions with police have been overwhelmingly positive. And that's something that we've been very fortunate to have, that I've been fortunate to have in my life experience. But I realize that doesn't necessarily reflect the experiences of everybody in our community. My interest in the SRO program started a couple years ago when the city was considering the Proposition 1 ballot measure on enhanced police services and community safety. And a fellow Human Services Commissioner, David Godfrey, brought this to my attention at one of our Human Services Commission meetings. And, you know, our fellow commissioners, we discussed this issue. We did a lot of research on this issue, and we decided that we wanted to take a stand as a commission against police in schools due to just the abundance of research showing the disproportionate negative impact of having police in schools has on students of color, students with disabilities, students from immigrant families, and LGBTQA+ students. So we sent a letter to council expressing our concerns. And as was mentioned, there was a lot of community support for having SROs in schools. And so as we all know, the program did end up being expanded to middle schools with the ballot measure. And so given that this expansion was happening, I really wanted to do my part to help mitigate some of the potential damage, which is why I decided to serve on the SRO task force. And I do think that the recommendations, as well as the RCW, does do a lot of good in helping mitigate those consequences. But I still have concerns about having police in schools. So I want to take this opportunity just to share that I still have these concerns, and that I do not think that we should have police in our schools in Kirkland. You know, even after serving on the task force for months with briefings from both city and school district officials, I still didn't have a clear answer as to what the purpose of having police in schools was, even after exiting the task force. There is, however, clearly documented scientific studies showing the damage done by having police in schools, most significantly feeding the school to prison pipeline. And I love our community. I know I say this a lot. I love Kirkland. I love our community. I love our local public schools. But our school district is not immune to these issues. Students of color and with disabilities are significantly more likely to face school discipline in Lake Washington School District. In the most recent data on the Washington State website for the 2018 to 19 school year, in Lake Washington School District, 5% of Black students were excluded from school in response to a behavioral violation, so they were suspended, compared to only 1% of white students. So Black students are 5 times more likely to be suspended than white students. Similarly, 5% of students with disabilities were suspended compared to less than 1% of students without disabilities. Those are huge differences. And comparisons are significantly worse for students in foster care, students experiencing homelessness, and students from low-income families. So as you can see, there's a pattern here that our most vulnerable students are most likely to face school discipline. And these students need more counseling, not more discipline, not more law enforcement.
Amy, I don't want to interrupt you, but we've got 2 council members who want to address the council, and we've only got, it's 7:16.
Okay, I have like 3 more quick statements, okay? Can I finish? So adding the law enforcement to this already failed system of discipline is directly related to a lifetime of criminalization. And just the mere presence in schools, I know we can collect data, but there are some things we can't collect data on. Just the mere presence of police in schools can be traumatizing to some of our students, can lead to mental health issues and to truancy. So I think our local SROs are amazing. I had the opportunity to get to know Officer King a lot during serving on the SRO task force. And he carries a Snickers bar in his vest. His kindness, his care, his expertise just oozes through him, right? This is not about an individual officer. We have fantastic police officers and SROs. There's a reason he was picked to be an SRO. This is more a systemic issue that I'd really like us to see, for us to see take on and really consider more thoughtfully. Even the state RCW says that these police officers are being used as counselors and teachers. As we know, our school district and our city have very limited budgets. And if we need those who have the skill sets to do those things. If we need more teachers, more counselors, I think we should be using those funds to fill those positions with those that are trained for those positions. And if the purpose is really to build relationships with our youth, which I think is a fantastic endeavor to do, we have great neighborhood resource officers that can visit the schools, that can hold events to build camaraderie with our youth without having to have a dedicated police officer. So,
okay, Amy, I'm going to have to cut you off, okay? Because I've got Councilmember Pascal.
I'll be quick here. Just a couple quick points. This has been a lot of work over the last couple of years. This was something that I pushed at the very beginning, and a lot of things have changed over 2 years. There was to be honest, there was resistance initially just to even do this, form a task force and take a look at what we could do better and or compare ourselves to best practices. So I'm proud that we've done this work. I support the recommendations. I do think that there would be some benefit to provide some supplemental information, either as an appendix or some additional documentation, just about our current experience in Kirkland and in the Lake Washington School District with SROs. I think the public will be wanting to see that information as we have more discussions. So that would probably be something that would be good to at least get in order if it's not already summarized. Ultimately, this has been a partnership with the school board. I look forward to hearing their thoughts on it. They are the ones that actually asked us to put SROs in middle schools. That was their request when we formed the Proposition 1. So let's just keep all that in mind a little bit. And I see if they make a decision that SROs don't belong in schools, we have to abide by that. So I do see the school board being a critical piece of this whole decision-making process. And then finally, I just look forward to more discussion. I think there's lots of folks that want to add information and partnership with the school board, information on this. And then I want to really make sure that we hear from the public and weigh our options going forward.
I have another person who logged on somehow.
Someone needs to mute their microphone. Thank you.
Oh,
We'll send the word out on that.
thank you.
Thank you. And now I have Councilmember Black.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I know we're running out of time. Just one quick comment about two of the recommendations, and it has to do with the school to police pipeline. It seems really important to me. I just want to make this observation. I guess I want to really underscore this point for the staff who's going to be working to implement these recommendations from the task force if we continue to have SROs in schools. Recommendation 1.1 and recommendation 3.4. I'm sorry, 3.3. 3.3 is ensure that SROs receive training on referring students to counseling or other services. Recommendation 1.1 is the key one that was discussed in detail during the presentation, helping keep students out of the criminal justice system. I really want to see those really closely coupled together. It's dangerous simply to say help keep students out of the criminal justice system. That could simply mean scaring teenagers with threats of the criminal justice system, and that's your means of keeping them out of the criminal justice system. It's really important to me that those two recommendations be very closely coupled so that our SROs have that mindset that they are using the referral system as really the element of keeping teenagers out of the criminal justice system. So if I could just make the point that those two are very closely linked in my mind, I'd like to see them. I'd almost like to see 3.4 emphasized before 1.1.
Okay, thank you.
There other comments?
Madam Mayor, you are muted.
And I'm
I
sorry,
know.
I meant, Assistant City Manager, I meant 3.3.
Yeah,
I kept saying 3.4. I really meant 3.3.
we would have figured it out.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have 8 minutes left. Councilmember Falcone, did you want to finish your statement? In which case, let's take 8 minutes of a break and say thank you very much to Debbie and to MJ for your work on this.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you to David for putting it together. And I'll see you all back here in 8 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.